Mr. John McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do hope the good humour continues, but we'll see. I admire the honourable member for his creativity at all times on raising matters. Mr. Speaker, well, you and I have been in the chamber for over 20 years watching budget debates now, and as you must probably know, I've referred in the past to the iron law of budgets. It's this, that the louder the cheers for the Chancellor on the budget day, the greater the disappointment 3 days later at the weekend. I'm revising that iron law. This budget didn't last 3 days, it lasted less than 3 hours. I want to address some of the main policy announcements in the budget, but I believe overall the Chancellor's statement evidenced the fundamental difference in values of our two parties. What we saw yesterday was a Conservative Chancellor boasting about tax cuts to the corporations and the rich, whilst refusing to effectively tackle the crisis in social care for the elderly, refusing to properly fund the NHS, and increasing the national insurance burden on many middle and low self-employed earners, and at the same time breaking a clear manifesto promise. Our values are these. We believe in a fair taxation system where everybody, no matter how rich and powerful they may be, they pay their way. We believe that through a fair taxation system and collective endeavour, the elderly and the disabled should be cared for, the sick should be treated, and children educated to develop their talents to the full. And that's not what we saw in yesterday's budget statement. And also, we adhere to manifesto promises. On the state of the economy, all the talk before the budget I saw from the press briefings from the Chancellor was the aim of providing a positive backdrop for Brexit. Well, that's not the real-world experience of millions of people. Yesterday, the Chancellor boasted about economic growth. But what's positive about Britain being the only large developed economy where, when economic growth returned, wages fell? What's positive about rising GDP if most people are worse off? What's positive about seeing the national living wage revised down again? What's positive about yet more downward revisions to wage forecasts? How can anyone describe, as the Chancellor did, an economy as match fit when people actually in that economy are seeing their standard of living fall and fall again? Wages are still worth today less than they were 9 years ago. The disposable income of non-retired households are less than they were before the financial crisis. The official forecasts are clear. Working people now, as a result of this government's choices and this year's budget, will be worse off. The official forecasts think they'll be nearly £500 a year worse off in 2021 than predicted in the autumn statement. Average earnings are expected to be £200 lower by 2022 than they were before yesterday's budget. And according to the Resolution Foundation, average earnings are only set to return to their pre-crisis peak at best by the end of 2022. Chancellor also claimed, I saw in one press release, that this is an economy built on resilience. It's an economy, to be frank, built on sand. Unsecured borrowing now by households has shot up to levels not seen since before the financial crisis. This should be a warning sound to all of us. The official budget for responsibility, the Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts show unsecured household lending rising to a shocking 47% of household income by the end of the decade. For many people today, this extra borrowing will be, to be frank, out of desperation. As prices rise but wages fail to keep up, many people are digging themselves deeper into debt just to get by. The Chancellor says he doesn't want to put the economy on a credit card, but that's exactly what he's doing and his policies are doing, forcing ordinary people onto dependence on their credit card. And there's no resilience in an economy that's failing in its fundamentals. Business investment fell over the last year for the first time since the depths of the last recession. Companies are cancelling planned investments because they're so terrified of what the future holds under this government, particularly with the risk of Brexit. They've seen 7 wasted years pass without the investment and the industrial strategy they need from this government. And yes, now they're fearful of its plans for Brexit. So productivity growth, the engine of prosperity, has stagnated. We're now lagging far behind similar economies. A typical British worker takes 5 days to produce what their German or French counterpart produces in 4. Now, the Chancellor, in a moment of lucidity, recognised the scale of the problem, but he failed to provide any new funding to deal with it. Worse than that, public sector investment will actually be £2.3 billion less over the next 5 years than planned in the autumn statement. And yes, people celebrated International Women's Day, but there were calls for a budget that works for women, but they've been ignored. Women are still bearing the brunt of this Tory government's failed austerity agenda, with 86% of cuts falling on women, a figure unchanged since last year, and the government yet again ignored the hundreds of WASPy women who turned up yesterday to lobby Parliament. Things are just as bad as ever for women under this government. So Labour calls upon the government to urgently publish an analysis of the true impact of their budgets and spending announcements on women, and to explain how they intend to reverse this disproportionate impact. Under a Labour government, all economic policies will be gender audited to ensure that we have an economy that works for all. Let me just turn on to some of the policy announcements in the budget. Let's turn to self-employment. The Chancellor's decision to push a £2 billion tax rise on low and middle earners self-employed, it just makes little sense. Certainly.
We need to find new ways to reward entrepreneurs and risk takers in our tax system. Does he accept that the difficulty is there's no way of distinguishing at present between such a person and, say, a professional like perhaps a journalist who has sought an arrangement with their editor to pay them as self-employed? And that is the difficulty. But with respect to the low-paid, 60% of those who are self-employed will actually see a reduction taking into account Class 2.
He raises a valid point with regard to bogus self-employment, which we thought the Chancellor might have even mentioned yesterday in his statement, never even referred to it. And it's something that needs to be addressed, because there are many people who are forced into self-employment or manipulated into self-employment, and bogus self-employment does need to be tackled, and that's what we've been campaigning for, along with a number of organisations, including a number of trade unions and the Federation of Small Businesses. But what we saw yesterday was middle and low earners hit. Someone on £20,000 will lose about £250 a year. Someone on £40,000 will lose nearly £650 a year. They're the consequences. And I don't think they're high earners. I think they're middle to low earners that should be protected, and particularly at a time when, to be honest, there's failed to the economy. Consumer spending is just dipping at the moment. That's their latest figures. And who are at the front of the impact of the consumer spending dipping? It will be largely those sole traders, those small traders that are out there at the moment, the window cleaners, the drivers and others. They'll be hit. So this is both wrong and also the wrong time to be putting their careers, their jobs in jeopardy. And you know, the justification for yesterday's policy just doesn't stand up. You can't demand more taxes off people without offering something in return. This party is fully behind looking at how the labour market is changing. The honourable gentleman is right in that. And my colleague, the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, spoke last year about the principles which should guide such changes. And we've raised the problem of bogus self-employment regularly, certainly.
I'm very grateful for him giving way. Does he also share my view that a lot of these people on low pay in self-employment also get no paid holiday, they get no paid sickness absence, and they have no protection against termination of employment?
I'll just give a quick anecdote. I was on the tube a month ago when a worker came on the tube, sat next to me in his overalls. He was going on night shift. He used to work for Tube Lights. The company went bust. He's a rail maintenance worker on a skilled job. He's now employed by an agency. He doesn't know whether he'll have work tomorrow or the next day or whenever. He's no sick pay, no holiday pay. If he doesn't turn up for work, he doesn't get paid. He has to pay an accountant to cover his tax and his salary payments. And then at the same time, he can be sold on from agency to agency and exploited in that way. That is not real self-employment. That's exploitation of someone who's been forced into self-employment. And there's issues that have to be addressed in that way. That insecurity, not just of the gig economy, but also because of what's happened in recent years in forcing people into self-employment. Those issues were not even addressed yesterday. And can I say that there is a problem of employers shirking their responsibilities by forcing staff into self-employment in that way. We did not get a package of measures yesterday designed to address the problems of the modern world of work. It was a single, unilateral tax hike for the self-employed. People earning over £8,000 will be hit. The Chancellor tried to disguise this yesterday by bundling into it the re-announcement of abolishing Class 2 national insurance payments. But yesterday's budget documents are clear. This is a tax hike of £2 billion targeted at the self-employed.
I'm listening carefully to what he's saying, and I wonder whether he agrees with the Croydon Conservative councillor James Thompson, who tweets, "Disgusted by this so-called Tory government hitting the self-employed."
I find what's interesting is the response to yesterday's statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been one of anxiety right the way across the political spectrum. And I'm hoping the Chancellor's listening. I'm hoping that both the Labour Party and other parties in this House will combine with some Conservatives who are concerned in that way, and we can force the Chancellor to think again. Let me just, if I can press on, the Chancellor, as I said, is concerned about the gap between different contribution rates. That's what he said. But we don't believe that actually the burden for closing the gap should fall on some of the most low-paid workers. And this is the consequences of that decision yesterday. They're making the minicab drivers pay more. So they're taxing, let's call it, the Uber drivers, whilst at the same time they're cutting the taxes of Uber itself. A hairdresser earning £15,000 a year will be £137 worse off as a result of yesterday's measures. That cannot be fair. That just cannot be right. And yes, it is a manifesto betrayal. There was a promise in the manifesto, and it read like this. It said this: "This means that we can commit to no increases in VAT, income tax or national insurance. Taxes on working people. This would harm our economy, reduce living standards and cost jobs." Not me, not Labour MPs, Tory manifesto. The government's been trying to muddy the waters a bit by talking about a bill they brought forward in 2015. This was a bill that sought to cap contributions for Class 1, and Labour supported that. It did not even allude to the fact that any other classes would see increases. And I quote the Chief Secretary. He said this, and I quote, "We do not have further proposals other than those we previously set out." That was what was said at committee. Some have tried also to portray yesterday's announcement as progressive, but what's progressive about raising taxes for the low-paid drivers while the government goes ahead with cuts to capital gains tax for a tiny few? What's progressive about raising taxes for low-paid self-employed cleaners while the wealthiest families in the country get a tax cut in inheritance tax? And what's progressive about raising taxes for plumbers while multinational corporations see their tax bills slashed year after year? What's not fair is £70 billion of tax giveaways for the wealthiest in the corporations while hiking taxes on middle and low earners. And just because the higher paid will pay a bit more, that doesn't make it right for the government to clobber those on low incomes to plug a gap in their finances. It's interesting, the government has promised a review, but the tax hike is already scheduled. So it may well be that there's jam tomorrow about benefits, maybe if you choose to believe the government. But now, who would actually believe the government after breaking a clear manifesto promise? This government could not have made its interests more clear in hiking self-employed taxes while slashing taxes for the corporations. And I just quote the Federation of Small Businesses, and it says this: "Increasing this tax burden, effectively funded by a reduction in corporation tax over the same period, is simply the wrong way to go." I agree. And meanwhile, the government's small incremental reforms to business rates fall far short of the radical long-term reform that's needed. They're just trying a delaying tactics. But business rates are a ticking time bomb, threatening to destroy many of our town centres. This, to be frank, is a government of the giant corporations and tax avoiders. It's not a government for workers, it's not a government for the self-employed, and it's not a government for small businesses. Let me turn to the social care system and the announcements yesterday. Our social care system is in crisis. In crisis. I have an anecdote with my own constituent I visited last week. A young woman looking after her father who's had 7 strokes. A mother with dementia, trying to hold down a job, can't get the care. As a result, cuts her hours, and that renders the income into her family for her own children extremely tight and difficult. That's one example in my constituency that's exemplified right there across the country, virtually every constituency, for the suffering that people have. According to the King's Fund, social care needs £2 billion now, just to cope with the emergency. And the Chancellor just failed to grasp the whole scale of the crisis. The money announced yesterday amounts to less than a third of what is needed. And what I resented yesterday is that the media had been trailed that the £2 billion was coming. But we were never told until the last minute it's £2 billion over 3 years. Nowhere near meeting the crisis that people are enduring at the moment. There's now more than 1 million people, and they're mainly older people, frail people, desperate for social care, that still can't get it as a result of this failure to address the emergency we're facing.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And as usual, making a very clever speech. I understand that this is a political moment because it's the budget debate. But does he think, sometime down the road, both sides can work together, not with this model, but to get a new model for social care?
I always respect the honourable gentleman's interventions because he seeks to find solutions. Seeks to find a solution. And exactly as my honourable friend has said from a sedentary position, this party tried the bipartisan approach, tried it hard. The honourable members worked in good faith to seek a resolution of this matter in the long term. They looked at a range of options. Halfway through those discussions, to be frank, we were betrayed. And it became, instead of a bipartisan approach, it became a political campaign, I think, of the worst order. It was a betrayal of confidence. It will take a lot, to be frank, to regain that confidence to enable us to go on a bipartisan approach. But we are willing to have those discussions with anybody, anywhere. But I tell you, the treatment last time went beyond political knockabout. It was an undermining and betrayal, not just of us as a party, but it was a betrayal of the older people, the frail elderly people who desperately needed a solution, and their families as well. Because families are imploding as a result of the lack of social care at the moment, because of the burden that they're suffering. The Women's Budget Group did an analysis of the budget last year and this, and they identified 2 groups of people who have been hit hardest by austerity measures. One was younger women with children, and the other were older women. I couldn't understand why initially until they explained it. It was because within our culture still, unfortunately, the burden of care falls still on women. But what happens, it was retired women who were then filling the gap of social care no longer being provided. So we're always willing to talk to anyone to find a practical solution. But it is in that backdrop, to be frank, of that sense of betrayal from the past, that sense of bad faith from the past.
I'm very grateful, and I really welcome his commitment to talk to anyone to try and find solutions. He may be aware that we've launched an initiative with Labour, Conservative and Lib Dem MPs to try and establish an NHS and care convention. Would he back that bid? It seems to me that it's absolutely essential that we set up a process to establish a long-term settlement.
It was a process of bringing MPs together as individuals, not as party representatives. Let's be absolutely clear about that. We'll look forward to any proposals that come forward from any source for consideration. And if we can find a practical way forward, we certainly will. But the most important thing at the moment is that we have an emergency at the moment.
Yes, we do.
We need £2 billion now, not sometime down the future, not over 3 years. We need it now because people are suffering, families are imploding. And I felt a sense of, well, I felt a sense of relief, first of all, when it was trailed that we were going to get £2 billion, and then extreme disappointment when we then told over 3 years. That was never mentioned in the press releases before the announcement itself. Yeah, certainly.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would he also agree that with the news today that the January figures of those who were waiting more than 4 hours for accident and emergency, which is 86%, the worst on record, is another example of how we're at crisis point within our health and social care systems?
My honourable friend, as always, prefaces what I was then going to come on to, which is exactly that, because not only did the government fail to address social care yesterday, they failed to address in any way the crisis in our NHS. It was completely ignored. We were warning, not just us, others were warning ahead of the autumn statement, that the NHS was in crisis. It was in crisis before the winter came this year. But the Chancellor couldn't find a single penny for the NHS in the autumn statement. The Royal College of Nursing now says the NHS is in its worst crisis ever. Ahead of the budget, the BMA, British Medical Association, called for another £10 billion for the NHS. And as the honourable friend has just said, today A&E waiting times have got worse again. More people are waiting longer than A&Es. And it's astonishing that this time in the budget there was a complete failure on the part of the Chancellor to recognise the scale of the crisis that our hospitals and our doctors are facing. And it's a crisis this government created by cuts. Instead, we have a £100 million fund to enable GPs to triage in accident and emergencies. But, Mr Speaker, the capital spend will be building rooms for GPs in hospitals with no GPs to staff them. Because there was no revenue funding associated with that proposal. I just asked the government.
I'm most grateful, Mr Shadow Chancellor, for giving way. It's not just the immediate crisis in the NHS, it is preventable future crises that will come, long-term conditions like diabetes, for example. There seems to be no planning for the future. Does he agree with me that we've missed an opportunity to invest in prevention that will save the taxpayer an enormous amount of money in the future?
I can remember my honourable friend, as part of his campaign, which I congratulate him on, he's stuck on this campaign for a number of years. I can remember him saying this some years ago under a previous Secretary of State, and there were assurances given about the investment in preventative medicine, etc. And then what happened? We had a £3 billion reorganisation, unnecessary, imposed on the top, and the money was lost. I congratulate him for his campaign. I regret he's had to continue it. But certainly in terms of the investment that we need investment in preventative health, but we need emergency funding now for the NHS itself. And I just return to it. It just shows the difference in values. Investment in the NHS needed on this side, tax giveaway, £70 billion over the next 5 years to those who need it least. People are suffering in the NHS. They need social care as well. People are dying because of the decisions of this government and because of their failure to address them, but also their prioritisation of tax cuts for big corporations and the wealthiest few rather than investment in our NHS. Let me come on to education and skills. The Chancellor in his speech claimed this as a budget for the young and for skills. He waxed lyrical about the need to provide decent chances in life for all. These are the sentiments we share. We share these sentiments. Extra funding for training is, of course, welcome. But the £500 million of additional skills funding is nowhere near enough to undo the damage of 7 years under this government. Adult skills funding has fallen by 54% since 2010. That's a cut of £1.36 billion. £500 million doesn't even come close to reversing the damage already done. The Chancellor is providing £1 billion for the vanity project of free schools. It's more money for a ludicrous throwback of grammar schools. Thousands of Whitehall hours wasted on schemes for a tiny handful of, yes, privileged children, leaving the rest to fail. It's the same old Tories, isn't it? Real terms funding cuts for state schools that 95% of our children use. The first cuts since when? Since the last Conservative government. 50s throwback of fantasies are not how you run a modern educational system. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, Brexit. The word that never spoke its name in the Chancellor's speech yesterday. Shocking. The Chancellor was silent on the greatest challenge facing this country. The word Brexit never passed his lips once during the speech. As Britain prepares to begin the process of leaving the European Union, the Chancellor had nothing to say on the matter. And it should be clear why. I think it's because he doesn't agree with the position of his own government. The Prime Minister claims no deal is better than a bad deal. This is absurd. No deal would be the worst possible deal. The Chancellor knows that, and he knows very well. He knows it's a risk because the warnings come not just from us, they come from manufacturers, business leaders, employers' organisations, trade unions and widespread civil society organisations. They come from economists and international organisations as well. From every part of our economy, the Chancellor is being told that to crash out of the European Union without a trade deal will be disastrous. Will be cut off from investment, will be cut off from our biggest trading partner, will be cut off from the skills and the contributions of EU nationals who have made so much of a contribution to our economy and our society. And it is a disgrace. It's a disgrace that those EU nationals live with insecurity still because this government will not give them the assurances that they need. But this is where the Conservative Party is now setting its course. Prior to the budget... Certainly.
I agree. It was absolutely shocking that there was so little mention of Brexit in the statement yesterday and in the Red Book, given that it's the greatest economic challenge facing the country. Would he agree with me? It's also shocking that there was a complete absence of any commitments on regional funding, which we are set to lose in places like Wales as a result of leaving the European Union, and which the government have repeatedly failed to guarantee that we will not be a penny worse off as a result of leaving the EU.
In a past life, I was responsible as Chief Executive of the Associated London Government to manage European funds for London overall. That include ERDF elements as well as ECF, European Social Fund, and a whole range of other funds. I know what contribution they make. And it isn't just the contribution they make. I know how much also investment they prize in from elsewhere. I also know what match funding is required and how you can build transnational partners into creative development of ideas as well. All that will be lost to us because this government won't give the assurances that we need.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. In the Liverpool City region, we're meant to welcome 30 million a year for the next 30 years, which is 900 million. We've lost over £1 billion in direct funding cuts to our 5 local authorities and £500 million in European funding has been granted for the last 2 rounds of that, with no guarantee for anything in the future. So there is a real issue, does he not agree with me, for regional development and regional funding to try to grow our economies from the bottom up?
I know how hard my honourable friend has fought on these issues, and I congratulate her. She's got a grassroots understanding of the consequences of this lack of funding and the implications it will have for her particular region and her city. The consequences are staggering, absolutely staggering, the lack of investment, but also it is the undermining of confidence in the private sector as well to match fund and invest. And that's what we're seeing at the moment, even at the first stage of this. And yet in the Chancellor's statement, as my honourable friend has said, not a word of assurance to anybody, whether council leaders, business investors or workers themselves. I found it disgraceful. And what's interesting, prior to the budget, the Chancellor and allies floated the idea that he was garnering a £60 billion fighting fund to deal with Brexit. It's not a fighting fund, it's a failure fund. That's what it is. He's having to put aside cash to deal with what he knows will be the consequences of a Tory Brexit failure. That's what the failure fund is for.
Would my right honourable friend, I'm most grateful. Since he is on the Brexit point, I thank him for giving way a second time. I was concerned, and I wonder whether he shares this concern, that no provision has been given to the Home Office for processing the applications of EU citizens, 3.2 million people. The Home Office has suffered enormous cuts over the last few years, and they will simply not be able to deal with the applications that are going to be made. At the moment, there is a 7-month waiting time to get your certificate in order to remain here. Does he not think that provision should have been made for that?
Should be made. It's the cuts that have already established. this will be an organisation, for whatever system is introduced, will not be fit for purpose because of lack of investment that he's consistently pointed out over the recent period. Can I just say this? We all understand the vote on the referendum. People voted to leave, but we repeat time and time again, they did not vote to trash their jobs or their livelihoods or the economy. And a responsible government would make sure both jobs and the economy are protected. A responsible budget ahead of Article 50 would show how the government would protect both. And the Chancellor has a responsibility here, but he failed to deliver on it. Let me just conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor dared to talk elsewhere about the difficult decisions he had to make. It's not him making the difficult decisions. It's the NHS manager in a hospital who's deciding whether someone will have a bed or a trolley. It's a police commissioner deciding which streets will be patrolled. It's a council leader which children's centre will be closed. They're the difficult decisions, not by the Chancellor. He's passing the buck to others for his own cuts. I think the Chancellor lives in a world completely insulated from the consequences of his decisions. He can sit in number 11 and delete lines on his spreadsheet without a thought for their consequences. For him, it's all in a day's work, and it's the rest of our society who have to deal with the results. We've had 7 long years of austerity from this Conservative government. Those spending cuts have dragged our economy and society to the brink. The suffering has been immense, and it's not the Chancellor or his colleagues that are on the receiving end. It's their victims, those parents who can't get a school place at the moment, those young people who can't get a decent home because of a housing shortage, those families who can't get care for their parents. And we've seen public services shredded and basic standards in public life torn up. And for what? So that this government can add £750 billion to the national debt. So after 7 years of austerity and 2 years after it was supposed to have ended, we can look forward, to continual cuts in public services for the rest of this decade. This was a budget of complacency. We need a government which has a fair taxation system, which ensures that those public resources are invested in long-term patient investment in our economy, that tackles tax evasion and tax avoidance at the same time, grows our economy, but makes sure, as we build a prosperous economy, it's shared by all and not in tax cuts for the rich and the corporations. Yesterday wasn't just complacent, it was arrogant and it was cruel. Yeah.